Welcome back to Joe Exotics APUSH period 6 review. We have the years roughly 1877 to about 1898 in this period 6. Not a whole lot of content, a little bit of Gilded Age, a little bit leading into the Progressive Era for period 7, but ultimately we're going to breeze through this as quickly as possible. So let's start in our post-Civil War expansion era. This is your Reconstruction in Second Industrial Revolution time period. So what's going on? What are people doing out in the West? People have already moved out to California. That's already over. Manifest Destiny has reached what they think at this time. It's reached the frontier, the end of the frontier. So what are people doing in the Great Plains area for money? You see mining, very popular, coal mining. You still see some, gold opportunities in various places besides San Francisco. Farming, obviously, your Great Plains are going to become the breadbasket of America, and the cattle industry, very, very important to the economy of the Great Plains. Now, the government during the Civil War, remember, very easy to push through legislation that the Republicans wanted because half the government was removed. During the Civil War, they're actually going to pass two very instrumental acts, being the Homestead Act and the Pacific Railroad Act. Homestead Act gave people land, 160 acres of land if they headed west. That's a huge incentive. And the Pacific Railroad Act is the government actually looking to build and expand on the railroad, which is going to become a very powerful monopoly, as we'll talk more about at the end of this period. Active federal government, as we said, what besides people moving out there, there's people already out there being the Native Americans. So that's a huge issue. We're going to talk about in a few moments some of the key battles with the Native Americans and kind of the end of their story as far as the white man versus the Native Americans and their clash. And like I said before, the subsidies for the railroads, the government actually giving the railroad land to build on. Really quickly, the Conservationist Movement. I don't want to say this is something that the exam always focuses on, but I definitely think you should be aware of the Conservationist Movement. This is really led by your poster boy there, John Muir, who is going to found the Sierra Club. This will not become a national platform until your Teddy Roosevelt era. However, be aware that we do create the Department of the Interior in 1849 that we're trying to be more aware of our land and our conservation of our resources. And as you can see there as well, the little fishies that are also going to be protected by the U.S. Fish Commission in 1871. Just be aware of the Conservationist Movement because we'll definitely bring that up again next period with the Teddy Roosevelt era. As I mentioned before, the Native Americans, what we're going to do with them, as we've always been doing with them, is kind of displacing them. And here we see the last major battles or conflicts between the white man, the Americans, and the Native Americans. Sand Creek Massacre is exactly what it sounds like, a massacre of over 100 Native Americans, mostly women and children. The Colorado militia takes them out. Very sad. The Battle of the Little Bighorn is actually kind of a different narrative than what we've seen in the past because this is actually a win for the Native Americans. The Sioux tribe is going to kill General Custer, who is famous from the Civil War, also nicknamed Custer's Last Stand. But that victory will be short-lived as we will come back and go after the Sioux after this brief victory. And in 1890, you see this ghost dance movement become very popular amongst the Sioux tribe, where they're kind of doing this ritual, like singing and dancing and thinking that they're going to bring back their ancestors, bring back the buffalo that have been killed by the white man. And we couldn't just let them have this little song and dance, and we go out in the Battle of Wounded Knee. And it's not really a battle. Again, it's pretty much like a slaughter. And the U.S. Army kills over 200 Native Americans who are pretty much defenseless. Not cool. Assimilation policies, obviously know what assimilation means, where it means you should force someone or a group of people to become more like you. We're going to force the Native Americans that want to become more like us. For example, the Dawes Severalty Act in 1887 was intended to break up those tribes. And basically it said, Native Americans, we will allow you to be citizens of the United States if you cut your hair, change your name, speak English, send your kids to English-speaking schools, lose your religion, and then you could become a citizen. And Native Americans had no interest in doing that. So this was obviously a failure. And Carlisle Indian School is just an example of one of those schools set up to help educate the children of these Native Americans. Okay, so the New South, when they talk about this on the exam, they're referring to post-Civil War. The New South is, kind of sees its own little revolution, if you will, in the sense that it's becoming more industrialized. But be careful, although we're building some more factories in the South and making them more industrialized, their economy is still based around agriculture. So although there's more factories, they're still going to make the basis of the most of their money off of selling cash crops. They rely heavily on the people on those farms, on those plantations. And remember, at this time, last period, we talked about tenant farmers or sharecroppers, who are either your poor Southern whites who can't afford to buy land for themselves, or the sharecroppers, those former slaves who don't know anything else. So they're going to rely heavily upon sharecroppers and those tenant farmers. Okay, the Industrial Revolution, remember, we do like to sound super smart. So the first Industrial Revolution was before the Civil War. That was your time period right before the Second Great Awakening, the Henry Clay era. Now the Second Industrial Revolution is post-Civil War. That's the time period we're talking about right now, your period 6. So you are going to see more industrialization. This is the time period where America goes from being number 10 in the world, in the industrial capacity it has, to number 1 within these, few decades here. And that's going to be because of a few different factors. One of them being urbanization, people moving to cities to work in those factories. We're going to talk about those workers in just a moment. There are new career opportunities for all types of people, especially women who are going to be working in factories, and also African Americans who are going to want to work in factories because they no longer have to be bound to the fields in the South. They can certainly move to the North or to those southern factories as well. Problem is, there is social prejudice amongst our Americans. Who would have thought Americans being prejudiced towards each other? Cough, cough. So let's talk about those workers. The workers start to organize heavily during this time period. We've seen unions come up in the past, but we haven't seen unions become that powerful just yet. The first major national union will be the Knights of Labor. Definitely know Terence Powderly is the guy who opens this up, who creates this in 1869. What's unique about the Knights of Labor is that they include all groups of people, both African Americans, women, and also skilled and unskilled workers. Problem was, those divisions within those groups of people is going to tear them apart. And they're really going to fall apart after the Haymarket Riot in 1886, because unions are then going to be associated with anarchy, and people don't want to be associated with that, and so they're going to lose popularity. After 1886, after the Haymarket Riot, you're going to see another union become even more powerful, and that will be the AFL, the American Federation of Labor. This one's going to stick around for a while. Samuel Gompers is the person to know who starts this one. They focused on skilled workers. They focused on what we call bread and butter issues, which are your basic issues like better pay, better hours, safer working conditions. And in a very short time, in 14 years, by 1900, they are the largest union in the country. So let's talk about the successes and the failures of labor unions, because although they are going to bring attention to the workers and their rights to these, corporate powers, they're going to also have a lot of failures, and it's going to be a while before the government steps in to help them. So yes, they do bring a national platform to workers and their rights. Guys like Eugene Debs is someone to know. Eugene Debs, we'll talk more about later on, but he is someone who, of course, ran for president numerous times, but he is also a socialist, and he is also someone who is going to fight a lot for workers all across the country. Now, the failures, the reasons that we don't see labor unions get a lot of ground here in this Gilded Age is the reason being that they don't have anyone on their side. meaning the government. The government is taking a back seat and kind of letting things unfold the way they should as they think naturally. Remember, we follow an economic idea of the wealth of nations by Adam Smith, where the government does not get involved. We call that laissez-faire. So the government doesn't want to get involved. Let's see some examples of that right now. The Homestead strike, as you can see in the top right there, this was at Carnegie's steel mill. And what happened was the workers wanted those rights, better pay, safer conditions, and they boycott. They basically go on strike. They don't want to work. And then Carnegie's boy, Henry Clay Frick, not the Henry Clay, but his boy Frick is going to bring in some hired police to put down the strike, and it's going to end. Again, the government did not get involved because they don't believe they have the right to. The Pullman strike 2 years later, this is President Cleveland. He actually is going to get involved. Problem is, not on the side of the workers. He's going to bring in the army to put down this strike for the railroad, and that's not good for the workers. The reason the workers aren't very successful is not only because they don't have the government on their side, but there's also, like I said before, there's a lot of divisions within the unions themselves, right? The skilled workers versus unskilled workers, two very different types of professions, the ethnic and racial groups involved, were whites versus blacks versus immigrants. There's a lot of hostility, okay, amongst those different groups. And so this is one of the biggest reasons that the workers are not successful during this era. Okay, so talking about workers, we can't forget about farmers during this time. The farmers are going to go through a lot all throughout our history, but in particular this time, they're going to be abused. So farmers, what's going to happen to them is that you're going to see a lot of farmers suffer because farming becomes more mechanized, where big-time plantation owners have the money to invest in these big machines to cultivate crops and help them. Problem is, not all farmers can rely upon that money and have enough money to buy such machines. So what are some of the big problems besides that for farmers during this time period? One, falling prices. You're going to see high tariffs during these administrations during this time period, and tariffs really hurt the South. They really hurt agriculture. Unfair railroad business practices. We talked about the railroad becoming America's really first powerful monopoly, and they are going to hurt the farmers the most out of all people, because they actually are the ones that are going to have the power to tell the farmers, hey, listen, we know that you need us. We're going to raise prices to whatever we want. And so the farmers suffer. We talked about high price of machinery, tight money supply. There's not a lot of hard currency going around. The farmer is going to fight for that in a second. We'll talk about that. And we talked about the high tariffs. Now, the farmers are going to organize, and they're going to create what we call the Grange movement, or the Grangers. Definitely be aware of them. The Grangers are going to organize and lobby for reform in our society. One of the more powerful groups of the Grangers in Texas, you see the Farmers Alliance, but that is not going to allow the African American farmers, and so the African American farmers are going to have to create their own alliance, the Colored Farmers Alliance. But ultimately, here's what you got to know: the farmers, although they may be not united as in the entire country, they are going to unite to create a third political party, and this is very significant: the Populist Party. The Populist Party is your farmers, your Grangers, and the things they're going to fight for are as follows. One, they want the government to own the railroads. They want intervention by the government. Remember, the government has, to this point, been laissez-faire. They want more coinage of silver. They want more money in circulation because they don't have a lot of gold and silver. They want more to be in circulation so that they can obviously have more at their disposal. Three, they want a graduated income tax, what we have today, the 16th Amendment. They will eventually get this through the Progressive Era, but the reason they want this is because they want the rich people to pay more taxes than they do. So that would make sense, and they will, like I said, eventually get that. Direct election of senators. It's kind of crazy to think that we never always voted for our senators, but that's something that the Populist Party is going to fight for, and again, will eventually get. And finally, the use of initiatives and referendums. These were part of that Wisconsin idea, if you remember, where um, Robert Lafayette will put together a bunch of state reforms of Wisconsin to give people more of a say in the government, and that idea spreads throughout the country. So the government intervening in this Gilded Age, we're not going to see that. Remember, they're going to follow a policy of laissez-faire. Don't forget, Mark Twain is the guy who coins this Gilded Age business. State governments versus federal government as far as interstate commerce goes. We talked about the Grangers wanting the government to step in. There's going to be a court case called Munn versus Illinois that says the states could regulate railroads. However, we've seen in the past when the states regulate interstate commerce, that's not good. And so they will overturn this with the Wabash case that says the federal government should regulate interstate commerce, which includes the railroads, which is good because now the government is getting involved, finally, and stepping in to help the farmers a little bit. This is going to lead to the passing of the Interstate Commerce Act, which, like we said, the government is going to regulate interstate commerce. And then they also create in 1890 the Sherman Antitrust Act, which is supposed to outlaw trusts and other monopolies. Sounds like a really good thing. Problem is, it's not going to be used very much until the administration of Teddy Roosevelt. And once he comes in, he's going to use the Sherman Antitrust Act to break up monopolies, as we'll talk more about in period 7. The movement of people within our country is both internal and external at this time. We're going to see people within the country move out to the west, out to the Great Plains because of things like the railroad and the Homestead Act. We're going to see people move to cities for those factory jobs. We're going to see African Americans also move within the country to escape the Jim Crow South, as we'll label later on the Great Migration. We also see immigration during this time period. So we see people from, we call the new wave of immigration, from Asia, from Poland, from Russia, from Italy, those places during this time period. We are going to see our very first immigration law during this time called the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. Not the last immigration policy or piece of legislation, but certainly the first. All right, and so we see a lot of movement within our country and also people from other countries coming to us as well. Okay, so talking about those people coming from other countries, as we've already mentioned, the Chinese Exclusion Act being one of those, being the first immigration law. And we can't talk about immigration law without talking about nativism. Nativism is a word that comes up in period 5 as we talk about the old wave of immigrants. Nativism is unfortunately something that we can still talk about today being relevant. Nativism, make sure you know the idea, the concept, what it means. What it does mean is that native-born Americans, not Native Americans, native-born Americans have a prejudice towards immigrants because they always think that they are taking their jobs from them. So you are going to see groups, they're going to be very nativist. We've already talked about the Know Nothing Party that formed in the 1850s, the 1840s and 50s in period 5. The American Protective Associations, an anti-Catholic group. Remember, during this time, we've seen a lot of Irish come to the country already who are predominantly Catholic. And literacy test is interesting because we usually associate literacy tests as being something that's going to bar African Americans from voting. But if you think about it, it's also going to be something used to bar immigrants from voting as well. So literacy test is a tool used by numerous states to prevent not only African Americans, but also immigrants from voting. Challenges of urbanization, immigration, we're going to see cities be divided. Think about New York, for example, where we have Little Italy, we have Chinatown, etc. All cities like Chicago, New York, Boston, they have these ethnic divides between the races, the ethnicities, and cultures. We've talked about low wages and dangerous working conditions for workers and how they attempt to organize and try to fight against that. You are going to see this be exposed by guys like Jacob Riis, and the other half lives. Jacob Riis is a muckraker, someone who unveils the dangers and the bad stuff going on in society. We'll talk more about that in period 7 with the progressive era. Child labor is becoming a problem, an issue. Kids are not going to school. They are going to factories, or they're working on the street corners selling newspapers or shining shoes to make some money for their family. Immigrants are going to attempt to assimilate, meaning learn English, but there is going to be a lot of resentment against these immigrants, as we've already mentioned. Now, political machines, guys like William the Boss Tweed, are going to take advantage of these immigrants. They're going to offer these immigrants who are coming off the boat a place to live and a job. In return, they want your vote. And so that bribery was legal back then. Today, that is illegal. You cannot do that. But that is something that political machines, guys like William the Boss Tweed, are going to use to become very powerful. Addressing the challenges of the Gilded Age, The Gospel of Wealth is written by Andrew Carnegie, who believes that he has a moral obligation to take his money and try to give back to those who are less fortunate. So, for example, Carnegie Hall is created in New York. You're going to see John Rockefeller create the Rockefeller Center in New York, and they're going to fund money to build libraries and schools all throughout the country to try to give back because they feel as if they are obligated to. Settlement house movement, we're going to see Jane Addams try to offer, through her Hull House, try to offer other immigrants a place to learn English, take classes, assimilate into American society. So these welfare ideas, right, they're something that the government is not doing at this time is being offered by people like Jane Addams, which is interesting. Social gospel movement is a religious obligation to help those in need. And then the socialists, okay, guys like Edward Bellamy, are going to paint a picture that we are headed towards socialism and capitalism is no longer working. We must evolve towards socialism and help everybody out because not everybody can survive. We can no longer live in this world where capitalism is working. But ultimately, all of these issues, I don't want to say will be solved, but they will be at least addressed or brought up during the progressive movement in period 7. Finally, social challenges during the Gilded Age. You're going to see women continue to fight through the National American Women's Suffrage Association. They're fighting for that right to vote, that 19th Amendment, or what we call suffrage. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Carrie Chapman Catt are your two leaders during this time period. We'll see during period 7 how they ultimately do get that right to vote. African Americans, two major people to know, Booker T. Washington, Webb Du Bois, who are both fighting for African American civil rights. They believe that both of them believe in African American civil rights equality, but they believe in different ways to go about it. Booker T. Washington believes that African Americans should gain vocational skills, that they should get jobs first and then demand that equality next. So it's a gradual approach. But then Du Bois is going to actually demand social, political, and economic equality right now. So a little bit different. And then you have Ida B. Wells, who is going to be an African-American woman who is also not only fighting for African-American civil rights, but also things like women's suffrage, also things like anti-lynching. So she is someone to know and be aware of as well. All right, so a lot of information here. We breezed through it pretty quick. I will say, though, that not a lot of this period is usually used on the exam, especially this year. But what is a common factor, what is something to be aware of, is they do like to talk about the progressive era on the movement, on the exam, I mean. So if they're using the progressive era, you're going to have to know about the Gilded Age and things that go wrong in the Gilded Age to set up the progressive era. So that's why it is very important to know. All right, hope this video helps. If you think it helps, give me a like or subscribe, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Peace out, Cub Scouts.